Hello and welcome back on my journey as I dive into the culture, the people, the history of Japan. And today I'm going to take a look at how professional wrestling did start in Japan. Now, I have a little vested interest in this because I was a pro. I mean, technically I still am. I'm not retired, but I am a pro wrestler for about 11, 12 years now. Not that I've wrestled since, that year, but you never know. One day I might get back in that squared circle once again, and who knows, maybe one day I'll be wrestling somewhere in Japan. Not likely, but you never know. So yes, we're going to dive into this video and find out just how did professional wrestling start in Japan, because you know what, I have no idea. So let us jump in.
What's up, everybody? My name is Karen and I watch wrestling. I'm learning about Japanese wrestling.
Hello,
and
Karen.
Today I am finally answering a question
it.
I've had since I've started this channel. It's actually one of the main reasons why I started this channel, which is, how did professional wrestling start in Japan?
That is a good question. I would like to know that, Karen. Karen watches wrestling.
Wrestling as a sport has
Good
existed
choice.
since ancient Greece, and in Japan, sumo wrestling has been one of the country's most popular sports for centuries.
This is true. There is a massive departure, though, from sumo wrestling and professional wrestling. I can't say I've ever done sumo wrestling, but I have done professional wrestling, and just by watching it, I do know there is a significant difference.
Dating as far back as 23 BC. Sumo is defined as a form of competitive full-contact wrestling, and it's an integral part of Japan's culture. So if Japan already had its own legitimate form of wrestling, how did pro wrestling, which was born out of carnivals and vaudeville halls, make its way into the country?
I would have thought it was mainly because it's something totally different from sumo wrestling. It's more about the drama and the story and the characters of professional wrestling. That's what a lot of people don't realise. It's like, people just dismiss pro wrestling as, oh, it's fake. But it's like, it's a story. You're taking the crowd on a journey in the matches, and the best wrestlers that work can do that with barely doing anything, and just like working that story, bringing the crowd into it. So I don't feel that it's really any kind of like comparison. But anyway, let's carry on.
According to Nippon.com, Japan's origins in pro wrestling date back to the 1800s, with Sorakichi Matsuda being recognized as the country's first professional wrestler. Matsuda was a former sumo wrestler, and he made his in-ring debut in the United States in 1883. He was a featured attraction in the U.S. who inspired other countrymen, as well as Japanese Americans.
I bet you in the US he was a heel. Bet you.
To follow in his footsteps.
In 1887, Matsuda tried to bring professional wrestling to Japan by staging the very first wrestling event in...
But by 1887, though, judo was all the rage, so, yeah, you're going to have your hard time there.
...in the country. The people of Japan had no interest in the sport. And tragically, Matsuda would die 4 years later at the age of 32.
That's pretty
young. The
young.
first man to attempt to bring professional wrestling to Japan would never get to see what lay ahead. Even though pro wrestling didn't exist in Japan, there were Japanese immigrant and...
Can I just say as well, with that picture, can we go back? Where is it? Where is it? The way he's got that guy's arm on his shoulder. I can't find it. Where is it? Oh, anyway, there. That's not how you do a Nippon Seanagi. If you were to come in like that to try and throw someone, that guy's just going to bring his arm up and like get Hadaka Jimmy on you. You need it further out. So like on the bicep part of the arm, you don't want it right over the shoulder. Nah, mate, that's bad. That's bad form.
See what lay ahead. Even though pro wrestling didn't exist in Japan, there were Japanese immigrant and Japanese American wrestlers over in the US throughout the early 20th century. And unfortunately, they were racially stereotyped and exoticized. So
that is like kind of like the origins of professional wrestling, isn't it? It's like an easy person to villainize. Oh, they're different from us. We'll villainize them. I'd like to think it has moved on a bit since then, but you know.
There were Japanese wrestlers in the US, but not in Japan. Now, what made that change?
That's what I'm here to find out.
The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold.
On August 15th, 1945, the Emperor of Japan announced his
sense where
country's
this is going.
unconditional surrender to the Allies, signaling the end of World War II. The surrender came after Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been ravaged by atomic bombs. Japan was now occupied by the U.S. military, and devastation from the war left citizens struggling to survive as well as rebuild. For this reason, General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the U.S. occupation, ordered that baseball, a sport that had already been popular in Japan, be reinstated as a way to boost morale for the country. Because of the war, all sports in Japan had been cut, so because of General MacArthur's order, the country's interest in sports
Makes sense, I
reignited.
guess.
This resulted in participating in numerous sports activities with
It's like you can't even begin to imagine what it must have been like for the people living there to sort of have that happen. And I hope it's something we never have to, like, anyone ever has to go through again.
the U.S. troops.
For better or for worse, the US occupation and its Western influence had an effect on Japan's culture. And combining this with Japan's reignited interest in sports seemed to be the perfect catalyst for professional wrestling to finally find its audience. And Riki Dozan would be at the helm of it.
Riki Doza. Has it got anything to do with New
According
Japan
to
wrestling? I don't really know
Nippon.com,
much about it at
professional
all.
wrestling in Japan, or Puroresu as it's called, began in earnest in 1951 with the debut of Riki Dozan, a man who wasn't even born in that country.
Born Kim Si-rak in what is now North Korea, Riki Dozan moved to Japan in 1940 at the age of 15, after being
only
scouted and
1940
recruited
then.
to become a sumo wrestler. In Chris Charlton's book Lion's Pride, he highlights that Riki Dozan received a lot of harassment and racial discrimination for being Korean, which was and still is common in Japan.
For context of this specific point in history, Korea was ruled by the Japanese Empire between 1910 and 1945, so there was a lot of hate going on.
In order to avoid this discrimination, a story was invented that Riki Dozan was actually born in Japan. He changed his name, taking on the surname of the man who brought him to Japan and adopted him. Kim Si-rak became Mitsuhiro Momota, born in Omura.
As a sumo wrestler, Momota was given the shikona, or ring name, Riki Dozan, and he had a successful
My only question now is, it's like, you're not going to get very far doing professional wrestling with just one person. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are many well, not many, but I have seen matches where they're not wrestling anyone. But on the whole, you need more than one person.
career between 1940 and 1950. He managed to reach the third highest rank in sumo, which is known as sekiwake.
There are a lot of reports stating that Riki Dozan would never rank higher than a sekiwake due to his Korean heritage. In fact, Michael Bozak from Tokyo Review wrote that sumo is the one sport that Japan has tried its hardest to isolate as its own, meaning they didn't want anybody who wasn't Japanese.
While people like Riki Dozan were able to join sumo, the system used to promote wrestlers to the highest ranks ensured that anybody who did not have Japanese roots would not reach.
Is this why he kind of left it and then decided to like start professional wrestling? And where did he learn? I don't know. Had they mentioned where he learned professional wrestling from?
Those ranks. Michael Bozak even notes that the first foreigner to reach the highest rank, known as Yokozuna, didn't occur until 1993.
That Yokozuna who wrestled in WWE. I'm sure. It's like, I know they had that backstory, but I think he actually didn't he? It looks like him. It does look like, I don't know his real name, but he was Hawaiian, wasn't he?
But according to the book Japan, the Riki Dozan Years, Riki Dozan was actually slated to be promoted to the second highest rank, known as Ozeki, before he decided to retire in 1950. The book lists several reasons for his abrupt retirement, which include racism, lack of money, and refusal of financial support. Rikidozan also cut off his top knot, which is a symbol for sumo wrestlers. After leaving the world of sumo, Rikidozan got into some shady dealings in order to make some money before petitioning to return to sumo. He was flat out rejected, so he ended up working in construction. But in 1951, a newspaper reported that Rikidozan had an interest in becoming a professional wrestler.
Okay. But again, I still don't understand, if it's not a thing in the country, how you go about doing that. Because it's like, for me, I had no idea that there was still professional wrestling going on in the UK when I became a wrestler. I was literally just stumbled across a website that spoke about training and just thought, I'll give that a go. But it's like, how do you take that step in the 50s to suddenly just become a professional wrestler when it's not even in your country? We need to get to this, Karen. That is her name, isn't it? Sorry if it's not.
That newspaper also reported that American wrestlers would be coming to Japan.
Ah, there we go.
In
What company
1951,
is
a
coming
wrestling
over?
promoter named Al Karasik had the idea to
don't
bring
know
professional
the
wrestling
name.
to Japan. Founder of Mid-Pacific Promotions in Honolulu, Hawaii, and a member of the National Wrestling
Okay, that
Alliance,
makes sense that it's
Karasik
Hawaii.
managed to be incredibly successful during his time as a promoter.
Now, I couldn't find a specific reason why Karasik wanted to bring wrestling over to Japan,
Money.
but the authors of the Rikidozan years wrote that there was a Japanese wrestler over in the US named
Big untapped
Tsu
market,
Tao
it's
Higume,
money.
who may have been trying to export professional wrestling from Hawaii over to Japan. Whether or not Karasik stole the idea, I have no clue, but given history...
It got there. It got there.
I'll let you form your
Probably.
own opinion. I will say that there was a Japan to America pipeline in existence when it came to wrestling, which I found fascinating. So judokas, and as a refresher, that's people
I was a judoka. I've not been on a tatame for ages.
who practice judo, would go
Second Dan.
over to Hawaii to do judo shows, and they would ultimately end
a
up
judo
becoming
show.
professional wrestlers.
Hey, do you know what? It's like, it is such a good filter to become a professional wrestler. If there's any kids out there that, like, if you got kids and they want to be a professional wrestler when they grow up, I would recommend getting them into judo until they're sort of like a bit older. I wouldn't bother going into these pro wrestling clubs that teach kids. Get them into judo, get them a solid background of how things actually work, how you actually like compete against people, and that is such a good skill to go over into the world of professional wrestling. I also have a background in acting as well, and the combination of those two things, you know, it really made my journey to get to, not like a really good wrestler, but get to a point where I was competent enough to be put onto shows, and it didn't take me too long to get there. Anyway, let's carry on.
And they would end up working for Al Karasik. So there was that connection there. Also, Karasik had connections, whereas I don't think Higame would have, because Japan was being occupied by the US military at that time.
So
Karasik's
there's, like,
liaison who helped
American
him make the show
connections to get
possible
there.
knew people stationed in Tokyo, including General Douglas MacArthur.
Backed by the Torii Oasis Shrine Club, Al Karasik and his liaisons produced a large-scale show that would travel to different cities in Japan as well as the military bases. 6 wrestlers would be showcased, making this the first time Americans wrestled in Japan.
Don't recognise any
While
of those
there
names.
are legends
None
surrounding
at
how
all.
Rikidozan got into wrestling, the
I wanna
authors
know how,
of
like,
the Rikidozan years wrote that the answer
the Japanese
was
companies started
very
get going.
simple. Bobby Bruins invited Rikidozan to join the American tour. Bruins wanted Japanese wrestlers in order to entice the locals to come to the shows, so he recruited Rikidozan
And let me
well
guess,
as
they were no
judokas.
longer heels
also,
in
it's
Japan.
worth noting that Bruins was one of the wrestlers on the American tour, and he was Karasik's booker over at Mid-Pacific Promotions. And Karasik himself claimed that Bruins laid the groundwork for promoting and booking in Japan. After only 1 month of training, Rikidozan made his professional wrestling debut on October 28, 1951. Now, if you think this was the beginning of wrestling's rise in Japan,
Probably not.
You're gonna have to wait a little longer.
Probably had to
the
wait
tour
a
ran
long
until
time.
December 1951,
Then
and
nothing
despite
for 40,
Karasik
50
raving
years.
about how successful it was, they never returned. Because, spoiler, they actually weren't successful. Pro wrestling in Japan.
That's a classic thing. It was like whenever I ran shows, it was always like, yeah, always just inflate the numbers a little bit. Because my shows were never that successful. I miss Full House.
Once again came to a halt, although there were a few attempts to drum up business by Japanese wrestlers who had worked over in the US, but unfortunately there was very little interest or talent. But a spark had been ignited in Rikidozan. The man who left sumo and was unable to reach great heights in that sport found a way to make a name for himself, and he would go on to be bigger than anybody could have ever imagined.
I've still not ever heard of him though.
After realizing
not
that his
heard of
sumo
him.
training
Did he
wasn't
go
going
over
to cut
to,
it for pro wrestling,
Hawaii?
Rikidozan left Japan in February 1952 to train and wrestle in Hawaii. He was trained by Bobby Bruins and Oki Shikina, who was considered one of the earliest Japanese pro wrestling stars in the US during the 1930s.
For a little over a year, Rikidozan wrestled in Honolulu and Northern California while learning about a completely different world than the sumo environment he grew up in.
I can
when
imagine it's a
Rikidozan
very
returned to
different
Tokyo
world.
in March 1953, he told reporters that he had over 200 matches in America and only 3 wrestlers had defeated him.
That doesn't really mean much.
Seems he learned very quickly how to hype himself up. Rikidozan's next moves would
That
be
is all it
imperative
is.
and prove
All the
that
wrestlers
he
believe in their
had
own
been
hype.
plotting. Having saved as much money as he could from his appearances in the US, Rikidozan secured influential sponsors in Japan, as well as funding from one of his former sponsors from his sumo days, who happened to be a mob boss. With this funding, Rikidozan built his own dojo.
Why is it
and
always
he
mob
established
bosses?
his own promotion.
And
It was known
New Japan?
as Nihon Puroresu Kyokai,
New Japan.
Pro Wrestling Association.
Ah, okay. This New Japan,
While Al
like a
Karasik
follow-on
believed
from
that
that
he
then.
could run a promotion in Japan, his lack of trying opened the door for Rikidozan, who saw the real potential. It's clear that he didn't just learn how to wrestle in the US, he learned how the business worked and the importance of television and promotion. The latter would prove to be key for Rikidozan's success.
The plan for JWA was to put on a wrestling tour and bring in American wrestlers. Rikidozan garnered as much publicity as possible, even convincing the president of Nippon Television Network Corporation to televise his first event.
And what's important to
that's
know
pretty
at this
good for a
time
first show.
is that television was very new to Japan. Nippon TV itself was only a year old.
The first event for JWA took place
Oh,
on
they've still
February
got footage.
19,
That's amazing.
1954 in Tokyo. 220
Those
giant
ropes looked a bit
televisions were
loose,
set up
but,
in
you know.
open spaces to ensure that as many people as possible could watch. Because television was so new to Japan, not many people owned a TV.
Using his connection with Mid-Pacific Promotion, Rikidozan brought over 2 wrestlers named Ben and Mike Sharp, who would act as foes in the main event tag match, where famous judoka Masahiko Kimura was recruited to be Rikidozan's tag partner. Kimura is considered to be one of the greatest judokas of all time. If you've ever heard of the Kimura lock, That's him.
After going to Hawaii to perform in judo shows,
recognize the name.
Kimura found himself joining the world of professional wrestling as well as Mid-Pacific Promotions. Kimura would later found his own promotion known as International Pro Wrestling Force, which was the first Japanese promotion to introduce Mexican lucha libre wrestlers.
The first event was a huge success, and thanks to Rikidozan's savviness to have television coverage, he became a national hero overnight. Rikidozan had the answer to making pro wrestling popular in Japan.
How are they received by the people whose land they occupy?
That is just like a classic thing. Yeah, the evil Americans. Obviously, it's like they're occupying your land at the moment. You beat two of them up in a wrestling show, making it look like they're cheating and everything. And that, yeah, I can see why that really got over. Good job.
As overlords, not as antagonists, not as men who are distrusted and feared and resented, but as friends.
Despite what American propaganda would have you believe, a lot of people in Japan felt bitterness and resentment towards the U.S. occupation.
Yes, I can understand
These feelings
that.
during post-war Japan allowed Rikidozan to use a staple in the American wrestling scene that would prove to be a money-making hit. The local hero defeats the big bad evil foreigner. The country who had been stripped of their power after the war now found a symbol of strength through Rikidozan.
Instead of the US military boosting their morale, it was now one of their own, and he beat the hell out of the Americans.
I'm just going to put it out there, but I'm pretty sure the American military did not boost the morale of the Japanese people at all. I mean, let me know if I'm wrong, but I'm gonna just guess at that.
Although, truthfully, Rikidozan was Korean and the Sharp brothers were actually Canadian, but that's a minor detail. Newspapers reported that over 45,000 people came to the first 3 shows JWA had, and the first television broadcast caused a huge surge in sales for television sets because people ran out to buy one so they could watch the other events. It was like everything came together to create a perfect storm, and Rikidozan
perfect time, perfect place, perfect idea.
In an interview a few weeks after the first event, Bobby Bruins referred to Rikidozan as the founder of Japan Pro Wrestling. And for this reason, you'll see him referred to as the father or the godfather of Japanese pro wrestling, depending on the publication. However, our buddy Al Karasik didn't seem to agree with that. In a letter to a fellow promoter, Karasik claimed that the success in Japan was his doing, and that it was his territory because he had spent years and money trying to get it started. Oh,
the territory thing. It's like, can't we all just get on? just you do your thing, we'll do our thing, and the public will decide. I had that in where I live. It was like, I've lived here since I was 4 years old in this city. And like another company decided to start running, like they had a show plan literally 2 weeks after my first debut show. And yeah, they were like pain. It's just like, mate, you don't even live in this. I live here. I've got every right to run. All I was like, yeah, just get on with it. You do your thing, that's fine. I'll do mine. Like one of the shows, they came down and started like putting flyers for their shows everywhere and like bad mouthing us all the time. It was just ridiculous.
Oh, the layers. In truth, Rikidozan used his connections with Mid-Pacific Promotions and NWA to bring wrestlers over to Japan.
True.
But Karasik's influence wasn't that significant. The authors of the Rikidozan years got confirmation that Rikidozan had learned everything he could about promoting when he was in the US. Although Karasik did try to take over the territory, as they say, but Rikidozan had enough friends on the inside that he was able to stop him.
Is this something to do with the mob boss?
Rikidozan and JWA were a certifiable hit throughout the 1950s.
So when did New Japan Pro
even
Wrestling
became a
come
movie
in?
star and recording artist, says Chris Charlton, and fans were coming out in droves to see his promotion. To this day, 2 of JWA's matches are considered to be among the most watched programs in Japan's history. Rikidozan versus Lou Thez in 1957.
I've heard of Lou Fez. Stone Cold Steve Austin, Lou Fez Press. I think he got it from him, obviously.
And Ricky Dozan versus The Destroyer in 1963.
I'm guessing he was a Mexican lucha libre wrestler.
When it comes to Ricky Dozan's influence in the world of Japanese pro wrestling, two magazines were born in 1955, Monthly Fight and Monthly Pro Wrestling. And the latter is actually still operating today. It's known as Weekly Pro Wrestling. When it comes to titles, if you've heard of the All-Asia Tag Team Championship and AJPW, those titles were actually
I don't know much about Japanese at all, so I haven't.
In 1955. AJPW revived the titles in 1976 after they were abandoned in 1973, and the All-Asia Tag Team titles are the oldest active titles in Japan.
Okay.
Women's wrestling also seems to have been born at this time when American female wrestlers visited the country in 1954. By 1955, there were at least 6 women's wrestling groups. I actually want to make a video about Joshi wrestling one day, so this is a good precursor. The first live TV wrestling program was also thanks to Ricky Dozan, which aired in June 1957. But one of the most significant contributions Ricky Dozan would make would be training new prospects, specifically 2 men who would go on to further shape the landscape of professional wrestling.
Definitely recognize one of them.
Antonio Inoki and Giant Baba. Both men made their professional debut in September 1960, and while they made waves in JWA throughout the 1960s, they would go on to make even bigger waves on their own.
Okay. On their own, eh? Taking out a big step there. Anyway, I think I'm going to stop it here. I know there's not an awful lot left, but you know, I think this video is long enough. And I've got like a basic idea now of how pro wrestling started over in Japan, which is good. But yeah, let me see who this video was. Oh, wrong mouse. Got two mice on my table. So that was from Karen Watches Wrestling. And if you did enjoy that video, please go over to their channel and give it a like. You know, if you liked my reactions, like my video. But if you liked that video, please go over there and give it a like. Because all I'm doing is just sitting there watching them. And they have obviously done quite a bit of work onto this video. So, sorry about that, Karen. I'm just lazy. But yeah, that is it. That is very interesting. I would like to learn more. I think I will try and look for more, for like something detailing the history from that sort of point. Because obviously there's not much of that video left, so I don't know how much they're really going to go in depth about the newer stuff. But if anyone's got any like suggestions for like videos that I should watch to like expand my knowledge on this at all, please let me know down in the comments, because I'm just starting out and it's hard to find these things. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me. And like I said, if you did like this video, my video, remember to like then go down, hit that like button. And if you want to see more of my reaction videos, then make sure you hit that subscribe too. But until next time, be nice to people. Bye.